The Black Lives Matter movement has taken America by storm. At best, this movement will lead to the election of a Democrat and reforms in the short term, and perhaps a more deserving place for African Americans in the long term. But there's an African proverb that corn cannot expect justice from a court composed of chickens. What that means is that as long as the African diaspora are in America, they cannot expect 100% justice. Not for a long time. And don't get me wrong, the efforts of some European and European Americans in this movement is commendable. It's just not enough. You see, many of us are missing the forest for the trees here. Why are there oppressed Africans in the Americas in the first place? The simple answer is that they were brought in as slaves to help build the country. There's a reason that we have minority black populations in the USA, but negligible minority white populations in most African countries. Any white people who do live in African countries are either descendants of European colonists or employees from first world countries. Both of these groups are more wealthy than the majority locals, and to some extent, both of these groups even have the option to go back to Europe. African Americans, on the other hand, wouldn't even want to move back to Africa. Because, let's face it, even by an African American standards, Africa is destitute. It's so rare that when it does happen, it makes the news. I'm not saying that either community would want to move back to their place of origin. I'm only highlighting a difference in social mobility. According to a report by Nathan Nunn, if it weren't for the colonial slave trade, 72% of the average income gap between Africa and the rest of the world would not exist today. Nathan is a prominent Native Canadian economist, and that's just my point. Like the Native Canadians and the African Americans, there are a multitude of people around the world who are still struggling to fight the hand of oppression. Forget the slave trade, there are still Western MNCs that exploit African resources today. These companies help build Western schools, roads, and help make their products cheaper. The worst part is that the West uses international institutions like the World Trade Organization to help them do it. In an article by a black Creole named Candice Leblanc, she says to white people, "I want you to know that you are the byproduct of a successful racist regime that has capitalized off black oppression and suppression for centuries. You can replace the word black with so many others, but let's keep the focus on Black Lives Matter for now." So that brings us to the question of today. Once the African Americans earn their rightful place in North American society, and I sincerely hope they do, will the European Americans show more compassion for the Africans who are still poor today? Will the future empowered African Americans show solidarity with their brethren who face the same oppressive hand? There are about 50 million black people in all the white majority countries around the world. There are more than 1 billion black people in Africa, many of whom were affected by the European slave trade. That's 20 times more people. So, do Black Lives matter? Or only the black lives that you can see? In an upcoming video, we'll look at reform of international institutions to make the world more equitable for all. I've been your host, Ashrit, and thanks for tuning in to Dharma Dhaba.